Tonight, our story is the story of China's rivers and mountains, its emperors and farmers, its silk threads and iron bells. We will begin before there was a China to name, before the written word, before dynasties and walls, when the land was still a vast patchwork of villages and the sky overhead was red like a book of omens. So breathe slowly, feel the quiet settle into your bones, and step with me into the first chapter of this endless, unfolding tale. In the deep folds of prehistory, before scribes etched symbols into bone and bronze, small communities lived along the gentle bends of rivers like the Yanlo and the Yangtze. The air was different, then thick with the smell of wild grasses and the warmth of cooking fires made from gathered reeds. The people of the Yangshao culture, who thrived as early as 5000 BCE, painted swirling red and black patterns on their pottery, shapes that may have told stories we can only guess at. These were villages of round, thatched houses clustered close to the fields, where millet swayed golden in the wind and dogs lay curled in the shade. To the east, the Longshan culture rose later, more complex, their pottery black and thin-walled, almost metallic in its precision, their walls fortified, hinting at tensions between neighbors. Legends tell us of a figure called the Yellow Emperor Huangdi, who may have walked somewhere between myth and memory around 2700 BCE. They say he taught the people to tame wild beasts, to build carts and boats, to weave silk from the shimmering cocoons of silkworms. In his time, or in the time of those who told his story, the compass was imagined, medicine was recorded, and the calendar began to trace the rhythm of the seasons. Another tale speaks of you, the great, the man who conquered the great flood. For years, the rivers swelled beyond their banks, drowning fields and homes, until you, through patience and relentless labor, dug channels that guided the waters away. The people loved him not for force, but for his persistence. And so, he became the first ruler of the Xia Dynasty, the earliest dynasty in Chinese tradition. Though archaeologists still debate its physical traces, in the Chinese mind it stands as the bridge between the age of legends and the age of history. With the Qing Dynasty beginning around 1600 BCE, history began to leave clearer marks. Here in the Fertile Cradle, along the Yellow River, cities rose with walls of tamped earth, their centers alive with bronze foundries. The Shang kings ruled not only by armies, but by divination, seeking the will of their ancestors and the spirits in the cracks of heated oracle bone sturtle shells and ox scapulae etched with sharp tools. Questions carved into their surface, the answers read in the web of fractures left by fire. Bronze vessels, cast in intricate patterns of touty masks and spirals, held food and wine for both the living and the dead. The air in Shang cities would have smelled of smelting fires and river mud. The clang of metal mixing with the beat of drums and the clear tones of early bronze bells. Shang society was layered nobles, artisans, farmers, zhij, bound by ritual and by the central belief that the ancestors watched over their descendants. Armies carried bronze-tipped spears, rode in wooden chariots, and wore armor of leather and bronze plates. Farmers worked the lowest soil with stone and bronze tools, while craft workers shaped jade into ornaments so finely polished they still gleam thousands of years later. Every aspect of life was touched by the cycle of ritual, sacrifice, and reverence. Each season tied to ceremonies marking planting or harvest, birth or burial. Beyond the city walls, smaller villages dotted the floodplains. Their people bound to the larger centers through tribute and loyalty to the ruling clan. To the north and west, steppes stretched toward lands of nomadic riders, while to the south, forests and wetlands teemed with other cultures distant, mysterious, yet destined to be woven into the growing fabric of China. And always, the Yellow River wound through it all. The river of sorrow and the giver of life. Its floods, both feared and welcomed. Its waters, carrying the silt that would feed empires, yet unborn. The Qing Dynasty would eventually give way to the Zhou. But here, in this early age, China's foundations were set trigil as the thread binding ruler, two ruled, ancestor to descendant, craftsmanship as both a practical skill and a spiritual calling, and the belief that the world, though vast and unpredictable, could be read-shaped and understood through careful human hands. The fires in their foundries burned late into the night, just as the fires of their stories would burn for thousands of years to come. The Zhou Dynasty emerged around 1046 BCE, carrying with it not just a new ruling house, but a new way of justifying power, the mandate of heaven. Imagine a clear, starlit night over the Loess Plateau, the air cool and still, while court scholars explain that a ruler's authority is granted not merely by bloodline, but by moral virtue. Should a king grow corrupt, cruel, or fail in his duties, heaven could withdraw its mandate, and the people would be justified in seeking a new leader. It was an idea that would echo through Chinese history, toppling dynasties and legitimizing rebellions for more than 2,000 years. The early Zhou kings ruled from their western capital at Haojing, near modern Shang, overseeing a vast feudal network. Land was granted to relatives and loyal lords, who in turn owed tribute and military service. The Zhou court was a place of solemn ritual. Bronze vessels and bells arranged in precise ceremonial order, music and poetry woven into governance. It was here that the Book of Songs began to collect verses, some praising noble deeds, others quietly lamenting loves lost or harvests failed. These poems preserved the heartbeat of everyday life, from court banquets to farmers' toil. Around 771 BCE, disaster struck. In what became known as the collapse of the Western Zhou, nomadic tribes from the northwest, allied with disaffected Zhou nobles, overran the capital. The king was killed, and the dynasty retreated eastward, founding a new capital at Luoyang. This shift marked the beginning of the Eastern Zhou, a time when the king's authority became more symbolic than real, while regional states grew powerful and ambitious. The Eastern Zhou was divided into two great eras: the Spring and Autumn period, 722–476, and the Warring States, period 475 to 221 BCE. During the Spring and Autumn period, Over 100 small states competed, though they recognized the Zhou king as a ceremonial figurehead. Alliances formed and dissolved like patterns in a kaleidoscope. The gentle rustle of bamboo scrolls carried the words of Confucius, who traveled from court to court, teaching that society should be ordered by virtue, filial piety, and the moral example of leaders. His sayings, recorded in the Analects, offered a vision of harmonious relationships and righteous governance. At the same time, Laozi was said to have wandered westward, leaving behind the Tao Te Ching, a quiet, poetic guide to living in harmony with the down the way. It spoke of yielding like water, acting without forcing, and finding power in stillness. Others, like Mozi, argued for universal love and pragmatic governance, while legalists such as Han Fizi declared that only strict laws and harsh punishments could control human selfishness. These competing schools of thought, Confucianism, Taoism, Mohism, legalism, were like different instruments playing in the same orchestra, their tones shaping China's intellectual and political life for centuries. By the Warring States period, 7 great powers dominated the land: Qi, Shu, Yan, Han, Zhao, Wei, and Qin. The wars they fought were relentless, and sophisticated armies now numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Iron weapons replaced bronze, and cavalry thundered across open plains. The crossbow, with its mechanical trigger, became a decisive weapon, its bolts whistling over battlefields dotted with banners. Behind the front lines, states strengthened their bureaucracies, levied taxes, built fortifications, and encouraged agricultural expansion to feed their soldiers. In the courts of these competing states, strategy and intrigue flourished. The Art of War by Sun Tzu, though rooted in the earlier spring and autumn period, became a treasured manual. Its lessons on deception, terrain, and the psychology of war as applicable in the candlelit council chamber as on the muddy battlefield. Despite the violence, culture thrived. Poets composed songs rich with imagery of rivers, mountains, and spirits. Scholars debated the nature of humanity late into the night, their voices mingling with the scent of burning pine in oil lamps. And everywhere, the people carried on: farmers tending rice paddies in the south, herders grazing flocks in the north, traders moving salt, jade, and lacquerware along roads that hinted at future silk routes. This age of division and rivalry seemed endless, yet beneath the chaos, a single state was quietly sharpening itself like a sword. The Qin, a once peripheral power in the far west, adopted legalist reforms that strengthened the central authority, reorganized land ownership, and made the army a tool of ruthless efficiency. By the late 3rd century BCE, their ambitions were no longer whispered. They intended not just to win battles, but to unite all under heaven. Soon, the wars of the warring states would end, but they would do so under a ruler who would change the very shape of China forever. The Qin state, once dismissed as a rugged frontier kingdom, had become the most disciplined war machine of the warring states era. Under the leadership of King Deng, later known as Qin Shi Huang, it absorbed the latest siege technologies, drilled soldiers with near-mechanical precision, and relied on the legalist philosophies' unyielding laws. Its ministers, especially the reformer Shang Yang in earlier decades, had stripped power from feudal lords, replacing inherited privilege with state-controlled merit appointments. Taxes were standardized, agriculture was intensified, and every able-bodied man owed military service. The Qin armies, clad in iron armor and wielding mass-produced weapons from state workshops, moved with terrifying efficiency. By 221 BCE, the wars ended, not in a peace treaty, but in total conquest. The banners of Qin flew over all former rival states, and King Zhen declared himself Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. For the first time in history, the vast lands of China were unified under a single central authority. From his new capital at Shenyang, he ordered sweeping reforms. The writing system was standardized, so merchants from the Pearl River could read contracts written in the Yellow River Plain. Axle widths for carts were made uniform, ensuring that rutted roads could serve all travelers. Weights, measures, and currency were unified to bind commerce into a single system. But Qin Shi Huang's vision extended far beyond bureaucracy. He ordered massive infrastructure works roads radiating from the capital like spokes of a wheel, and the first version of the Great Wall, built by linking and extending older fortifications to guard against northern nomads. This wall was no gentle boundary, was a grueling project of stone and tamped earth, costing countless laborers' lives, their bones rumored to be buried within the mortar. In the south, canals stitched together river systems, moving grain and troops with equal ease. The emperor's obsession with immortality was equally ambitious. He dispatched expeditions to seek the elixir of life and ordered the creation of a sprawling mausoleum complex, guarded by thousands of life-sized terracotta warriors, each uniquely carved with individual expressions and armor. Buried in ranks beneath the earth, they would protect him in the afterlife as surely as his armies had in life. Yet, the Qin Dynasty's strength was also its weakness. The same harsh legalist laws that had disciplined the realm bred resentment. Forced labor and high taxes drained the populace's patience. When Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE, his successors proved less capable. Within just a few years, rebellion erupted across the empire, and by 206 BCE, the Qin Dynasty had collapsed. Steed's grandeur reduced to a cautionary tale about ruling with fear alone. From this chaos rose the Han Dynasty, founded by Liu Bang, a man of humble peasant origins who became Emperor Gaozu. His rise was a story whispered with admiration in taverns and markets, reminder that destiny could bend for those with will and cunning. The Han softened the Qin's harshness, blending legalist administration with Confucian ideals of benevolence and moral governance. Scholars were valued, and civil service examinations, though still in early form, began to shape the bureaucracy. The capital moved to Chang'an, a city of broad avenues, bustling markets, and glittering palaces. There, court astrologers tracked the movements of stars, while artisans wove fine silks and cast delicate bronze mirrors. Under Emperor Wudi, the Han expanded their borders. Dramatically, armies marched deep into Central Asia, subduing the Zhongnu nomads and securing trade routes that would become the legendary Silk Road. From Chang'an, caravans laden with silk, lacquer, and paper traveled westward, returning with horses, glassware, and ideas from distant civilizations. Han society flourished. Paper, invented during this period, transformed record-keeping and scholarship. Historians like Sima Qiang composed sweeping chronicles of the past, embedding China's story in a continuous, living memory. Confucianism became the official state ideology, its teachings carved into stone and recited in schools. At the same time, Taoist thought and folk beliefs wove through daily life. Temples rose in quiet valleys, incense curling upward into cedar-scented air. Peasants worked the land with iron plows, their fields fed by elaborate irrigation systems. In cities, merchants traded in goods and gossip, acrobats performed in open squares, and physicians blended herbal medicine with careful observation of the body's balance. Women, though bound by patriarchal norms, could wield influence in family and court politics. Figures like Empress Laozi demonstrated the power possible for those who navigated the palace, assist shifting tides. Yet even the Han's golden age faced shadows. Corruption, eunuch influence at court, heavy taxation, and factional struggles eroded stability. Natural disasters were often interpreted as signs that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven, spurring uprisings like the Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 CIA, peasant-led movement calling for a return to simpler, more just governance. By 220 CE, the Han Dynasty fractured into rival kingdoms, marking the end of one of China's most celebrated eras. Still, the Han legacy, the script, the administrative systems, the sense of a unified Chinese identity would echo through every dynasty to come. The land now moved into centuries of division, but the memory of Han order lingered like the aftertaste of fine tea, shaping every dream of reunification that followed. The fall of the Han left the empire split like shards of a once great mirror, each fragment reflecting a piece of the old order. Warlords rose from the chaos, and in the year 220 CE, the realm crystallized into three major powers: Wei in the north, Shu in the southwest, and Wu in the southeast. This was the era of the three kingdoms, a time as romanticized as it was bloody. Chroniclers and storytellers, centuries later, would weave its battles and intrigues into epics like the romance of the three kingdoms, where cunning strategists such as Zhou Liang, with his feather fan and quiet gaze, became icons of wisdom, and generals like Guan Yu, with his flowing beard and unshakable honor, became deified as symbols of loyalty. Though the battles were fierce, armies clashing on riverbanks, sieges stretching for months, fleets set aflame in naval ambushes, the political map shifted constantly. Alliances formed and shattered like clay cups dropped on a stone floor. Yet culture did not wither. Even in wartime, poetry, calligraphy, and music persisted, nurtured in warlords' courts and among wandering scholars. But the dream of reunification was never abandoned. And in 280 CE, the Qin unification, however, was fragile. Court factions schemed, imperial princes quarreled, and by the early 4th century, nomadic invasions from the north splintered the dynasty. The period that followed, known as the 16 Kingdoms, saw a kaleidoscope of short-lived states ruled by various ethnic groups. Zhongnu, Shanbai, Ji, Di, and Kong. In the south, the Eastern Qin Dynasty maintained Han Chinese traditions, governing from Zhangkang, modern Nanjing, while northern China experienced waves of cultural fusion between steppe nomads and settled agriculturalists. This turbulent time birthed the northern and southern dynasties for 20 to 589 CE. A long stretch of political division, but also of cultural flowering. Buddhism, introduced centuries earlier from India, now gained deep roots. Carried along the Silk Road and embraced by emperors and commoners alike. Monasteries multiplied, scriptures were translated into Chinese, and colossal grotto temples like those at Yongyang and Longmen were carved into cliffside silent stone, Buddhas gazing over rivers and plains. The arts flourished, intricate Buddhist statuary, refined ceramics, and calligraphy that captured not only words but the movement of the writer's spirit. Reunification came with the Sui dynasty in 589 CE, under Emperor Wen, whose rule was short but transformative. The Sui launched massive infrastructure projects, the greatest of which was the Grand Canal linking the grain-rich south to the political heart in the north. This artery, still vital in later centuries, allowed goods, troops, and messages to flow across the empire with unprecedented speed. The Sui also restructured the civil service, reinstating merit-based examinations and standardizing laws, attempting to bind the country under efficient central rule. But their ambitions were overreaching. Costly campaigns against Korea and relentless construction projects strained the people, leading to revolt and the dynasty's rapid collapse in 618 CE. From the ashes of the Sui rose the Tang Dynasty, one of China's most radiant golden ages. Founded by the Li family, the Tang combined military strength with cultural brilliance. Chang'an, the Tang capital, became the largest, most cosmopolitan city in the world. Its streets thronged with Persian traders, Sogdian dancers, Korean envoys, Japanese monks, and scholars from as far as India and Byzantium. Market stalls overflowed with spices, gems, glassware, and silks from every horizon. Tea houses buzzed with debate and music, and Buddhist temples stood beside Taoist shrines and Confucian academies. Under Emperor Taizong, the empire consolidated and expanded, pushing Chinese influence deep into Central Asia, securing trade routes and establishing the Tang as a diplomatic and cultural superpower. His reign set the tone for a dynasty that prized not only governance but the cultivation of the arts. Poetry reached sublime heights. By S. Moonlit Wanderings and Du Fu's Quiet Reflections became immortal verses, recited softly by scholars for over 1,000 years. Empress Wu Zetian, the only woman to rule China in her own name, proved as shrewd as she was controversial, balancing ruthless political maneuvering with the patronage of Buddhist projects and educational reforms. The Tang legal code, admired across Asia, became a model for governance in Japan and Korea. Yet the dynasty was not immune to strain. The An-Lushan Rebellion of 755, a devastating civil war led by a frontier general, shattered the Tang stability, leading to massive population loss and weakening imperial authority. Though the dynasty survived for another century, the later Tang emperors saw their power diluted, and regional military governors grew increasingly autonomous. Still, even in decline, the Tang's cultural radiance endued its blend of Chinese, Central Asian, and foreign influences, created a legacy of art, music, and literature that would echo for centuries. By 907 CE, the Tangs gave way to the chaotic 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, a half-century of fragmentation that nonetheless sowed seeds for the next great unification under the Song. But in memory, the Tang era remained a high watermark of civilization. Its streets and gardens shimmering in the mind's eye, like a city glimpsed through morning mist, forever alive with the footsteps of poets and merchants, monks and courtiers. When the dust of the 5 dynasties settled in 960 CE, the Song dynasty emerged not with the thunder of sweeping conquests, but with the quiet consolidation of administration, culture, and economy. Founded by Emperor Taizu, the Song prioritized civil governance over military dominance, entrusting power to scholar officials chosen through an expanded and refined imperial examination system. These examinations, based on Confucian classics, were now open to a wider pool of candidates than ever before, allowing talented men from modest families to rise to high office through the sheer mastery of words and ideas. The empire's heart was not in frontier conquests, but in the elegance of bureaucracy, the hum of markets, and the beauty of art. The Song capital, first at Kaifeng and later at Hangzhou, became vibrant centers of trade and urban life. The Grand Canal bustled with traffic. Rivers carried barges laden with rice, porcelain, and tea. Paper money jiaos was introduced, transforming commerce and enabling the rapid exchange of wealth across vast distances. Agriculture thrived thanks to innovations like early ripening Campa rice from Vietnam, which allowed 2 harvests a year and supported a booming population that swelled beyond 100 million. Technological ingenuity defined the era. The Song witnessed the first known use of gunpowder in weaponry, not yet in the thundering cannons of later centuries, but in fire lances and explosive arrows. Movable type printing, invented by Bai Sheng, made the reproduction of texts faster and more affordable, spreading knowledge at a scale unseen before. Mariners navigated with the aid of the magnetic compass, and ship designs advanced to carry goods farther and more safely across the seas. Landscape painting reached sublime heights, with artists like Fan Quan and Guo Shi capturing mist-shrouded mountains and winding rivers in delicate ink, washes images not merely of nature, but of harmony between humankind and the cosmos. Culturally, the Song era saw the flourishing of Neo-Confucianism, led by thinkers like Zhu Xi, who sought to synthesize Confucian ethics with metaphysical questions, providing a moral and philosophical framework that would guide East Asia for centuries. Tea drinking evolved into a refined art form. Poetry was prized among the literati, and urban theaters staged plays that drew crowds from all walks of life. Yet, the dynasty's military weakness became its enduring flaw. From the north, the Khitan-led Liao Dynasty, then the Qin Dynasty, pressed against Song borders. By 1127, the Jurchen captured Kaifeng in the Jingqing incident, taking the emperor and court into captivity. The surviving members of the royal family fled south, establishing the Southern Song with Hangzhou as its capital. Though smaller in territory, the Southern Song maintained economic vitality. Maritime trade routes connecting China to Southeast Asia, India, and the Middle East. Junks laden with silk, porcelain, and tea sailed to ports as far as the Persian Gulf, returning with spices, gems, and stories from distant lands. The Southern Song's resilience could not withstand the storm that rose from the steppes. The Mongols, under the leadership of Genghis Khan and later his grandson Kublai Khan, the Mongol Empire swept across Eurasia, conquering vast lands with unmatched speed. By the mid-13th century, the Mongols had subdued the Jin in the north and turned their gaze southward. The Song resisted fiercely, but in 1279, the last remnants of their navy were destroyed at the Battle of Jōmon. The final Song loyalists, including a young boy emperor, were lost to the waves, ending an era. Under Kublai Khan, China entered the Yuan Dynasty, 1271 to 1368. The first time the entire empire was ruled by a foreign power. Kublai moved the capital to Dodo-modern day Beijing and adopted many aspects of Chinese governance while maintaining Mongol supremacy. The empire was divided into social classes, with Mongols at the top, followed by Central Asian allies, Northern Chinese, and finally, Southern Chinese. While this hierarchy bred resentment, it also created a cosmopolitan court. Envoys and merchants from across Eurasia arrived in Dadu, bringing goods, technologies, and tales. Among them was Marco Polo, the Venetian traveler whose vivid accounts of Yuan China fascinated Europe. The Yuan invested in infrastructure, expanding the Grand Canal and promoting trade along the Silk Road. Advances in astronomy, medicine, and cartography flourished under Mongol patronage, drawing from both Chinese and Islamic knowledge. Yet, their rule faced challenges: natural disasters, corruption, and rebellion brewed in the countryside. The Mongols' reliance on military might could not suppress the growing discontent. And by the mid-14th century, uprisings like the Red Turban Rebellion signaled the dynasty's weakening grip. By 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang, a former peasant monk turned rebel leader, seized Beijing and drove the Mongols back to the steppes. With this victory, he founded the Ming Dynasty, marking the return of Han Chinese rule and the dawn of a new chapter in China's long flowing story. The Ming Dynasty began in 1368 beneath the steady hand of Zhu Yuanzhang, who would reign as the Hongwu Emperor. Rising from poverty and the chaos of the Yuan collapse, he was determined to restore order with a government rooted in Confucian orthodoxy and strict moral discipline. The civil service examinations regained prestige, and regional military garrison sways ensured that local defense was tied to agricultural self-sufficiency. Land reforms sought to ease peasant burdens, while sumptuary laws dictated what citizens could wear, reinforcing social hierarchy through the very texture and color of clothing. The capital at Nanjing bustled with granaries, workshops, and stone gates, etched with imperial proclamations before the Yongle Emperor later shifted the seat of power to Beijing, commissioning the vast Forbidden City Palace complex of vermilion walls, golden roofs, and echoing courtyards where each step was choreographed by centuries of ritual. The early Ming period was one of stability and confidence, and nowhere was this more boldly expressed than in the great maritime expeditions led by Admiral Zhang. He, between 1405 and 1433, fleets of treasure ships larger than any wooden vessels the world had yet seen sailed from Chinese ports to Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the Swahili coast of Africa. Laden with silks, porcelain, and tea, they returned with exotic goods, giraffes, and emissaries who marveled at the grandeur of the Ming court. These voyages, however, were as much about demonstrating imperial power as fostering trade. When the expeditions ceased, the empire turned inward, focusing its resources on fortifications like the renewed and extended Great Wall, now clad in stone, and watchtowers stretching across the northern frontier like a dragon's spine. Ming society thrived on agriculture, with rice, wheat, and tea plantations feeding a population that grew steadily. Urban life blossomed. Nanjing and Beijing's markets bustled with papermakers, silk weavers, booksellers, and tea houses. Literacy expanded, aided by woodblock printing, which spread not only Confucian classics, but also popular novels such as Journey to the West, Water Margin, and Romance of the Three Kingdoms, works that would embed themselves deep into Chinese cultural identity. The arts were vibrant. Ming porcelain, especially the cobalt blue and white wares from Qing Dynasty, became prized across the known world, traded to Persia, Europe, and beyond. Yet, the dynasty's vast bureaucracy and rigid hierarchies sometimes stifled flexibility. Court eunuchs, initially confined to minor roles, gained increasing power, often clashing with scholar officials. Corruption festered in the shadows of the Forbidden City, while, on the borders, threats multiplied. The Mongols remained a constant menace to the north and in the east. The rise of Japanese Woko pirates troubled the coastal provinces. By the late 16th century, silver flowing in from Spanish America via Manille fueled the economy, but also created vulnerabilities when global trade shifted. The Ming military faced its ultimate test in the early 17th century with the rise of the Manchus in the northeast. Internal instability, fiscal strain, famines, and peasant uprisings weakened the state. In 1644, rebel forces under Li Zikeng seized Beijing. The last Ming emperor, Changjin, took his own life upon a hill behind the Forbidden City. Seeking to quell the chaos, Ming loyalist generals opened the Great Wall to Manchu forces, who quickly claimed the throne, establishing the Qing Dynasty and beginning a new era under banners of a different hue. The Qing Dynasty, proclaimed in 1644 by the Manchu rulers of the Aisin-Zhou clan, entered China not as mere conquerors, but as shrewd inheritors of a vast civilization. They retained the Ming administrative framework, the Confucian civil service examinations, and the intricate etiquette of the imperial court, but overlaid it with Manchu custom skew hairstyles became mandatory for men. And the 8 banners military system structured both governance and defense. The early Qing emperors, particularly Kangxi, Yangzhang, and Qianlong, presided over a golden age that fused martial strength with refined culture. Kangxi, reigning for more than 60 years, personally toured the empire, quelling rebellions, overseeing flood control, and encouraging scholarship. His reign saw the compilation of encyclopedias, dictionaries, and maps that sought to encompass the empire's vast knowledge. Under Yang Zheng's tireless, if austere, administration, tax reforms stabilized state revenues, while the Qianlong Emperor, a cultured and ambitious ruler, extended China's borders to their greatest territorial reach. Tibet, Xinjiang, and parts of Central Asia were incorporated into the empire, and tributary relations extended to Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The Qianlong court became a center of art and craftsmanship enamel. Jade carvings, intricate lacquerware, and literati paintings flourished under imperial patronage. Scholars produced vast compilations like the Siku Quanshu, a library of over 36,000 volumes designed to preserve and standardize Chinese literature, though also to censor works deemed subversive. The Qing also presided over a population boom fueled by new crops from the Americas sweet potatoes, maize, peanuts that expanded cultivation into marginal lands. Towns swelled, markets thrived, and the Grand Canal once again served as a lifeline between the grain-rich south and the political heart in Beijing. The countryside hummed with the rhythms of planting and harvest. The metallic ring of blacksmiths, hammers, and the calls of merchants peddling cotton cloth and porcelain wares. But beneath this prosperity, tensions brewed. The strict social hierarchy, coupled with ethnic distinctions between Manchu rulers and Han subjects, sowed quiet resentment. The bureaucracy's rigidities made it slow to respond to the pressures of a growing population, land scarcity, and local corruption. By the late 18th century, costly military campaigns in Burma, Vietnam, and Nepal strained the treasury. The 19th century brought storms that would test the king's very survival. Foreign traders, particularly the British, began flooding Chinese ports with opium, reversing centuries of trade imbalance. The Qing, alarmed at the social and economic harm, launched efforts to suppress the trade, culminating in the First Opium War, 1839 to 1842. The resulting Treaty of Nanking forced China to cede Hong Kong, open treaty ports, and grant extraterritorial right to foreigners, humiliation that marked the beginning of what Chinese historians call the Century of Humiliation. As Western powers pressed deeper into Chinese markets, internal rebellions erupted with devastating force. The Taiping Rebellion, 1852-1864. Led by Heng Shuquan, who claimed to be the brother of Jesus, turned large swaths of southern China into battlefields, costing tens of millions of lives. The Naiyan Rebellion, Muslim uprisings in Yunnan and Xinjiang, and other local revolts further eroded Qing stability. Meanwhile, a second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, deepened foreign intrusion, with the burning of the old summer palace in Beijing becoming a lasting symbol of imperial vulnerability. Efforts at self-strengthening followed, blending Western military technology with Chinese governance. But reforms were piecemeal and hampered by conservative resistance. Modern arsenals and shipyards appeared in places like Fuzhou and Tianjin. Railways and telegraph lines began to snake across the land. Yet these could not fully stem the tide of decline. The late 19th century brought further humiliation with the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, in which China's loss of Korea and Taiwan signaled a new rival's ascent in East Asia. The Boxer Rebellion, 1899 to 1901, a xenophobic uprising against foreign influence, was crushed by an international coalition, leading to yet more punitive indemnities. By the early 20th century, reformers and revolutionaries alike saw the dynasty as incapable of guiding China into a modern world. The 1911 revolution, led in part by Sun Yat-sen's Revolutionary Alliance, toppled the Qing, ending over 2,000 years of imperial rule and ushering in the fragile beginnings of the Republic of China. The fall of the Qing in 1911 did not bring the neat, orderly birth of a modern nation, but rather a fragile republic, held together by idealism and frayed by competing ambitions. Sun Yat-sen, revered as the father of the nation, envisioned a China built on his three principles of the people nationalism, democracy, and the people's livelihood. Yet his provisional presidency in 1912 was short-lived. Under political pressure, he ceded power to Yuan Shikai, a former Qing general whose ambition leaned toward monarchy more than republicanism. Yuan dissolved parliament, suppressed opposition, and in 1915 declared himself emperor, move that sparked outrage and widespread rebellion, forcing him to abandon the throne within months. His death in 1916 left a dangerous vacuum. What followed was the warlord era, a period when China fractured into fiefdoms ruled by provincial military strongmen. Beijing might have remained the nominal capital, but real power lay in the hands of men who commanded private armies, collected their own taxes, and fought one another in shifting alliances. Railways and riverways became military supply lines rather than arteries of national commerce, and regions often issued their own currencies. Still, life for ordinary people carried on with rhythms as old as the dynasties. Farmers planted rice and millet under the same skies their ancestors had known. Craftsmen fired porcelain in Jingdezhen kilns, and markets bustled with the exchange of silk, tea, and incense. Yet, the political fragmentation meant lawlessness in the countryside, heavy levies from competing armies, and uncertainty over which flag might be raised over the nearest garrison tomorrow. In the cultural heart of cities like Shanghai, Beijing, and Tianjin, however, a different China was emerging. Printing presses churned out newspapers and political pamphlets. Cinema houses flickered with silent films and hosted debates on everything from constitutional law to Marxism. The May 4th movement of 1919, sparked by student protests against the Treaty of Versailles, decision to hand German concessions in Shandong to Japan, became a lightning rod for new ideas. Intellectuals like Chen Duxu and Hu Shi called for the abandonment of Confucian traditions they saw as shackles on modern progress, advocating vernacular literature, science, and democracy. Foreign powers continued to maintain their enclaves and privileges, from the international settlement in Shanghai to treaty ports along the coast. Japan's 21 demands in 1915, seeking to extend its influence over Chinese territory and economy deepened resentment. At the same time, Soviet Russia, newly forged from its own revolution, began cultivating ties with Chinese reformers, offering ideological and organizational support to those interested in communism. By the early 1920s, two political forces began to crystallize in response to the chaos. The Kuomintang Nationalist Party, or KMT, seeking to unify China under Sun Yat-sen's vision, and the newly founded Chinese Communist Party, CCP, inspired by Marxist-Leninist doctrine. For a time, these unlikely allies, brokered through Soviet mediation, cooperated in the First United Front, aiming to end the warlord fragmentation through a military campaign known as the Northern Expedition. The stage was thus set for a new chapter in China's story, one that would see ideologies clash, alliances fracture, and the nation lurch toward both unification and fresh turmoil. In the whisper of those years, one can almost hear the rustle of manifestos in dim-lit meeting halls, the tramp of soldiers drilling in dusty courtyards, and the quiet determination of a people yearning for a China that could once again stand whole. The fragile alliance between the Kuomintang KMT and the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, unraveled in 1927, shattering the temporary unity forged during the Northern Expedition. Chiang Kai-shek, now the leading figure of the nationalist movement after Sun Yat-sen's death in 1925, feared communist influence as much as warlord resistance. In what became known as the Shanghai Massacre, his forces turned on communist allies, executing thousands of party members, labor organizers, and sympathizers in the streets. The split ignited a civil war that, though it would pause for foreign invasion, simmered for decades. The KMT established its capital in Nanjing, ushering in what was called the Nanjing Decade, 1928 to 1937, a time of partial stability, modernization and reform, yet also deep corruption, authoritarian control, and uneven reach beyond major cities. Chiang's government worked to strengthen the economy, promote industrialization, and expand education. Rail lines extended farther inland, banks consolidated, and a new legal code attempted to replace the patchwork of regional regulations. Western-style universities flourished in Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing, producing engineers, doctors, and intellectuals trained in both modern science and traditional Chinese scholarship. Cultural life thrived in the cities. Shanghai became the Paris of the East, with Art Deco architecture, bustling jazz clubs, and a cinema industry producing films that blended Chinese storytelling with Hollywood glamour. Yet in rural China, where the vast majority lived poverty, landlord exploitation, and outdated agricultural methods left millions in hardship, the CCP, retreating to rural bases after its urban defeat, capitalized on these grievances, organizing peasants and developing guerrilla tactics. Japan's growing militarism cast a long, darkening shadow over China. Having seized Manchuria in 1931 and establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo under the deposed Qing Emperor Pui, Japanese forces tightened their grip in northern China. The League of Nations condemned the aggression, but sanctions were toothless, and Japanese expansion continued. The Xiang incident in 1936, in which Chiang Kai-shek was detained by his own generals, forced a truce between the KMT and CCP to form a second united front against the looming threat. That threat erupted into full-scale war in 1937 after the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing, marking the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. The conflict was catastrophic. 1937 unleashed one of the most horrific episodes of the war, the Nanjing Massacre, where Japanese troops committed mass killings and atrocities against civilians and prisoners of war, leaving an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 dead. Cities were bombed, farmlands scorched, and millions of refugees streamed inland to escape the advancing Japanese army. The KMT moved its wartime capital to Chongqing, enduring relentless aerial bombardment, while the CCP expanded its influence in the countryside through resistance bases and propaganda that emphasized their commitment to the people's survival. Despite their truce, the KMT and CCP remained deeply distrustful of one another, often competing for territory and influence, even as Japanese troops occupied swaths of the country. Guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and intelligence operations harassed Japanese supply lines. Civilians bore the brunt of suffering, with famine, disease, and displacement claiming millions of lives. International aid, particularly from the United States and Soviet Union, provided weapons, advisors, and training, though often limited and subject to political calculation. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, drawing the United States into World War II, China officially became one of the major Allied powers. Yet the war dragged on for 4 more brutal years, with battles in places like Changsha and Hanyang exacting a heavy toll. The eventual Allied victory in 1945, brought by Japan's surrender after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ended the war, but left China exhausted, fractured, and on the brink of another internal conflict. The temporary wartime unity dissolved almost immediately, and the long-suspended civil war between nationalists and communists roared back to life, setting the stage for the next decisive transformation in China's history. With the surrender of Japan in August 1945, China's 8-year nightmare of foreign invasion ended, but peace was fleeting. The departure of Japanese troops left a power vacuum across vast territories, and both the Kuomintang, KMT, under Chiang Kai-shek, and the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, under Mao Zedong, moved quickly to seize control. The United States, hoping to prevent renewed war, brokered talks between the two sides in Chongqing, but deep distrust, unresolved ideological rifts, and competition for political legitimacy doomed the negotiations. The fragile truce collapsed in 1946, plunging China back into full-scale civil war. Unlike in the 1920s, the balance of power had shifted. The CCP, hardened by years of guerrilla warfare against Japan, commanded disciplined armies and enjoyed deep support among peasants in the countryside, especially in northern China. The KMT initially held the advantage, controlling major cities, railways, and international recognition as the official government of China. Well armed with American-supplied weapons and operating from Nanjing, they launched offensives into CCP-held areas, retaking some key territories. However, corruption, poor logistics, inflation spiraling out of control, and low morale among conscripts steadily eroded their position. In contrast, the CCP implemented land reforms in liberated areas, redistributing land from landlords to peasants, winning enduring loyalty. They also maintained strict discipline among their troops, contrasting sharply with the behavior of some nationalist forces, whose abuses alienated local populations. By late 1947, momentum had shifted dramatically. The People's Liberation Army PLA, the CCP's military arm, launched major counteroffensives in Manchuria under the command of Lin Bao. The decisive Liaoshen campaign in 1948 shattered nationalist control in the northeast, cutting off a vital industrial and agricultural region. The WWII campaign, fought across the Central Plains, became the largest and most decisive battle of the war, with over 1 million troops engaged. The PLA's victory there effectively destroyed the main KMT field armies, while the Pingjin campaign secured Beijing, then Beiping, and Tianjin for the communists. By early 1949, the nationalist collapse was irreversible. Chiang Kai-shek resigned as president and retreated with loyal forces to the island of Taiwan, vowing to continue resistance from there. On October 1, 1949, in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, Mao Zedong stood before a vast crowd and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China PRC, declaring that the Chinese people have stood up. Across the mainland, red flags replaced the blue and white KMT emblem, and the new communist government moved quickly to consolidate power, integrate remaining warlord territories, and begin reshaping the nation according to Marxist-Leninist principles adapted to Chinese conditions. Yet the birth of the PRC was not a complete unification. The nationalists maintained control over Taiwan, the Pescadores, and several offshore islands, establishing Taipei as the capital of the Republic of China, ROC. Both the PRC and ROC claimed to be the sole legitimate government of China, a dispute that would shape geopolitics for decades. The mainland, however, had entered an entirely new era, one defined by radical social engineering, one-party rule, and a vision of transforming an ancient civilization into a socialist state capable of standing among the world's great powers. The first decade of the People's Republic of China was one of both consolidation and upheaval, as the communist leadership sought to stabilize a war-ravaged nation while radically transforming its political, social, and economic structures. In 1949, the country lay in ruins. Industrial output had collapsed. Transportation networks were broken, and millions were displaced. Yet, the new government moved with astonishing speed to assert control. Provincial administrations were reorganized under communist cadres. Remnants of warlord influence were dismantled, and the People's Liberation Army undertook sweeping campaigns to bring Tibet, Xinjiang, and other frontier regions under central authority. Land reform became the signature. Domestic policy. Landlords were dispossessed, their holdings divided among poor peasants, often accompanied by public struggle sessions that blended revolutionary fervor with brutality. China's entry into the Korean War in October 1950 marked its dramatic emergence on the world stage. When United Nations forces under General Douglas MacArthur pushed deep into North Korea. Approaching the Yalu River, Mao Zedong ordered the deployment of the newly named Chinese People's Volunteer Army. In freezing winter conditions, wave after wave of Chinese troops crossed into Korea, catching UN forces off guard and driving them southward. The war was costly. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers died, but it solidified Mao's reputation at home and signaled that the PRC was prepared to challenge Western military power in Asia. The 1953 armistice restored the status quo along the 38th parallel, but left China diplomatically isolated from the West, even as it deepened ties with the Soviet Union. The alliance with Moscow brought technical assistance, loans, and expertise. Soviet engineers helped build hundreds of factories, steel mills, and infrastructure projects during China's first five-year plan, 1953 to 1957. Heavy industry output surged, cities expanded, and literacy campaigns sought to educate a population where illiteracy had been the norm. At the same time, the state tightened ideological control. Newspapers, literature, and the arts were brought under the guidance of the Communist Party, and political dissent was stifled. In 1956, the 100 Flowers campaign briefly encouraged intellectuals to voice criticisms of the government. Mao proclaimed, "Let 100 flowers bloom. Let 100 schools of thought contend." But when criticism proved sharper than expected, it was swiftly met with repression in the anti-rightist campaign of 1957, during which hundreds of thousands were labeled rightists and sent to labor camps or marginalized for life. Rural society underwent its most dramatic reorganization through the creation of agricultural cooperatives, which gradually evolved into massive people's communes. The goal was to collectivize farming, pool resources, and accelerate agricultural output to match the rapid industrial growth of the cities. In practice, the changes disrupted traditional farming rhythms and eroded local initiative. The late 1950s saw the launch of the Great Leap, a campaign aimed at transforming China into a socialist utopia by simultaneously boosting agriculture and industry. Communes were encouraged to produce steel in backyard furnaces, while communal dining halls replaced private kitchens in the belief that collective life would foster revolutionary spirit. The early PRC years were marked by a sense of intense national purpose and optimism, but also by deep undercurrents of coercion and control. For many peasants, land reform and the end of landlord dominance brought a sense of liberation. For urban workers, the new factories promised stable employment and access to healthcare and housing. Yet, the political atmosphere grew increasingly intolerant of dissent. By the end of the decade, the optimism of the early revolutionary period was about to be tested by one of the most severe man-made disasters in modern history. In 1958, Mao Zedong unveiled the Great Leap Forward, a campaign as ambitious as it was perilous. The goal was to propel China past its Western rivals in both agriculture and industry within a few short years, transforming it into a communist utopia powered by human will rather than material constraints. The nation's vast rural population was reorganized into approximately 26,000 people. Commune, esh, a self-contained unit responsible for farming, industry, education, and even military training. Private plots were abolished. Communal dining halls were introduced to break traditional family eating habits, and production targets soared beyond any realistic measure. Perhaps the most infamous symbol of the Great Leap was the backyard steel furnace movement. Across the countryside, peasants were mobilized to melt down scrap metal pots, pans, tools into crude steel ingots. Villages diverted labor from the fields to keep these furnaces burning day and night. But the resulting metal was often useless slag. Meanwhile, local officials, under intense pressure to meet state quotas, inflated production figures, reporting record harvests that never existed. The state requisitioned grain based on these exaggerated numbers, leaving villages with dangerously depleted food supplies. By 1959, the gap between official reports and rural reality became tragically clear. Poor weather compounded the effects of misguided policies, and a catastrophic famine began to spread. Entire provinces suffered hunger on an unimaginable scale. Mortality rates soared. Estimates of famine-related deaths range from 15 to over 30 million. Starvation drove people to eat tree bark, wild grasses, and, in extreme cases, the flesh of the dead. Local resistance, quiet theft of grain from communal stores, families hiding food was met with harsh punishment. The famine was not publicly acknowledged at the time, and state propaganda continued to trumpet the successes of the Great Leap Forward, even as rural China withered. The political fallout was severe. At the 1959 Lushang Conference, Defense Minister Pang Dewa criticized the Great Leap's excesses, warning that the country faced disaster if policies were not corrected. Mao interpreted this as a personal attack and a betrayal, moving quickly to purge Peng and tighten his grip on the party. Yet the crisis could not be ignored indefinitely. By 1961, pragmatic leaders like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping introduced reforms. Communes were scaled back. Private plots were restored, and grain imports from Canada and Australia provided some relief. The early 1960s marked a cautious recovery. Agricultural output slowly increased. Small markets re-emerged, and light industry was encouraged alongside heavy industry. Relations with the Soviet Union, however, deteriorated sharply. Disagreements over ideology, foreign policy, and leadership of the global communist movement exacerbated by Mao's criticisms of Soviet revisionism, led to the Sino-Soviet split. Soviet experts were withdrawn from China in 1960, leaving infrastructure projects unfinished and depriving the country of crucial technical assistance. Despite famine's shadow, this was also a period of cultural resilience. Traditional operas were adapted to socialist themes, rural literacy campaigns resumed, and the state invested heavily in public health mass vaccination programs. For instance, dramatically reduced rates of smallpox and other diseases. Yet beneath the surface, ideological tensions were building. Mao, feeling sidelined by the more moderate leadership, began to contemplate a new political upheaval, one that would mobilize China's youth. challenge the entrenched bureaucracy, and reassert his revolutionary vision on an even grander scale. This storm would soon be known as the Cultural Revolution. In 1966, Mao Zedong launched the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, a movement he framed as a defense of socialism against the creeping influence of bourgeois values and capitalist restoration. In reality, it was also a dramatic bid to reassert his dominance after the setbacks of the Great Leap Forward and the rising prominence of more pragmatic leaders like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. The campaign began with ideological critiques, but quickly swelled into a tidal wave that engulfed every layer of Chinese society. Mao called upon the youth to take the lead, and millions of middle school and university students responded with fervor, forming Red Guard units that pledged absolute loyalty to the chairman. They donned green military-style uniforms, brandished the little red book of Mao's quotations, and traveled across the country on free train passes, spreading revolutionary slogans and rooting out those deemed counter-revolutionaries. And even veteran party members found themselves publicly humiliated, beaten, or driven into internal exile. Ancient temples, Confucian shrines, classical artworks, and rare books were destroyed as old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits were targeted for eradication. Liu Shaoqi, once Mao's designated successor, was denounced as a traitor and capitalist roader, stripped of his posts and subjected to brutal treatment that led to his death in 1969. Deng Xiaoping, too, was purged, sent to work in a rural tractor repair factory. Power increasingly concentrated around a new Maoist inner circle, including Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, and her allies, later known as the Gang of Four, who promoted revolutionary operas and films aligned with their ideological vision. The upheaval extended into the People's Liberation Army, PLA, which was called upon to restore order as factional violence erupted among rival Red Guard groups. Armed clashes broke out in factories, universities, and city streets. In some regions, these escalated into civil war-like conditions. Millions of urban youth were eventually sent up to the mountains and down to the countryside to learn from peasants, a vast relocation policy that disrupted education and scattered a generation. Foreign relations during this period oscillated between confrontation and realignment. The Sino-Soviet split deepened into open hostility with border clashes in 1969 along the U.S. Caesarea River. Yet, in a surprising twist, Mao pursued rapprochement with the United States in the early 1970s, leading to President Richard Nixon's historic 1972 visit to Beijing. This opening marked China's return to the global stage after decades of relative isolation. Even as internal politics remained dominated by radical campaigns. By the mid-1970s, Mao's health was failing, and factional struggles over succession intensified. Premier Zhou Enlai, a stabilizing figure, died in January 1976, prompting an outpouring of public grief that soon transformed into mass protests at Tiananmen Square, protests that were suppressed and labeled counter-revolutionary at the time. Later that year, a powerful earthquake struck Tangshan, killing hundreds of thousands, adding to the sense of national trauma. Mao died on September 9, 1976, closing a chapter that had defined an era. Within weeks, the Gang of Four was arrested, effectively ending the Cultural Revolution. The nation was left physically and psychologically scarred, education systems in disarray, infrastructure neglected, and trust in leadership fractured. Yet, out of the chaos, a new path for China was about to emerge, one that would pivot from revolutionary zeal to pragmatic reform, under the guidance of leaders who had once been cast aside. When Deng Xiaoping emerged as China's paramount leader in 1978, the country was weary from decades of ideological campaigns and economic stagnation. Deng had been purged twice during Mao's rule, but returned with a determination to steer China away from the chaos of the Cultural Revolution towards stability, prosperity, and modernization. His vision, famously summarized as "it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice," was a sharp departure from Maoist orthodoxy, signaled a pivot to pragmatism over rigid ideology. The economic reforms began in the countryside. The collectivized communes that had dominated rural life since the 1950s were dismantled, replaced by the household responsibility system, which allowed individual families to lease land, decide what to plant, and sell surplus crops in open markets after meeting state quotas. Agricultural productivity surged almost immediately, leading to better food availability and higher incomes for peasants. Encouraged by these results, Deng extended reform to urban areas, introducing market mechanisms, loosening price controls, and permitting private businesses to operate first in limited spheres like small restaurants and workshops, but soon expanding beyond. A key component of Deng's strategy was the four modernizations: agriculture, industry, defense, and science and technology. Special economic zones, SEZ, were established in coastal cities such as Shenzhen, Zhuhai, and Xiamen, offering tax incentives and fewer bureaucratic hurdles to attract foreign investment. These zones became laboratories for capitalism within a socialist framework, drawing multinational companies, advanced technologies, and export-oriented manufacturing. Shenzhen, once a fishing village, began its rapid transformation into a bustling metropolis. Foreign relations shifted dramatically as China opened to the world. Diplomatic ties with the United States were formally normalized in 1979, and trade relations expanded rapidly. Chinese students and scholars were sent abroad in large numbers, particularly to the United States, Europe, and Japan, to study modern science, engineering, and business practices. The influx of new ideas began reshaping intellectual and cultural life at home, where magazines, films, and literature cautiously explored topics beyond revolutionary themes. However, the reforms also created growing pains. Inflation and corruption crept into the system, and the widening gap between rich and poor stirred discontent. State-owned enterprises struggled to adapt to competition, leading to layoffs and uncertainty for millions of workers who had long depended on the iron rice bowl of guaranteed employment. Urban youth, inspired by ideas of democracy and human rights, began to push for political reforms to match the economic liberalization. These tensions came to a head in the spring of 1989, when students gathered in Beijing's Tiananmen Square to mourn the death of Xiaoping, a reform-minded leader who had been ousted from the party's top ranks. The mourning quickly evolved into a broader pro-democracy movement, calling for political freedoms, anti-corruption measures, and greater government accountability. The protests spread to cities across China, drawing support from intellectuals, workers, and even some officials. The leadership was divided. Some advocated negotiation, others a firm crackdown. In June 1989, the People's Liberation Army moved into Tiananmen Square, and the protests ended in a violent confrontation that left an untold number dead and wounded. The images of tanks and unarmed citizens became symbols around the world of China's political limits, even as its economic reforms continued. By the close of the 1980s, China's trajectory was clear. It was no longer the closed, agrarian society of Mao's early years. It was a nation in the midst of an extraordinary transformation, one that would accelerate even further in the decades ahead. As market reforms deepened, cities swelled, and China's place in the global economy grew ever more central. The 1990s began under the shadow of international sanctions and diplomatic isolation following Tiananmen. But Deng Xiaoping was not ready to let reforms stall. In 1992, during his famous southern tour to Shenzhen and other booming cities, Deng reaffirmed China's commitment to opening up, warning party cadres that development is the hard truth. His words reignited economic momentum, leading to a surge in foreign investment, manufacturing output, and infrastructure projects. Coastal cities exploded with new skyscrapers, neon-lit shopping districts, and sprawling industrial parks. Rural migrants by the millions streamed into urban centers, trading farmland for factory floors, and in the process, fueling the largest migration in human history. During this decade, China's export-led growth became the engine of its rise. Cheap labor and an enormous workforce made it the world's factory, producing everything from textiles to electronics for global markets. The government launched massive infrastructure initiatives. Highways stretched across provinces. New ports deepened to handle container ships, and entire districts sprouted overnight. Shanghai, long dormant as a commercial center, rose again with the construction of Pudong's futuristic skyline. Meanwhile, Hong Kong returned to Chinese sovereignty in 1997 under the one country, two systems formula, marking a symbolic moment in China's re-emergence on the world stage. Politically, Zemin and later Hu Jintao maintained the Communist Party's tight grip, while embracing selective modernization. The slogan "Socialism with Chinese characteristics" became the ideological umbrella under which capitalist practices thrived. Private enterprise expanded, the middle class grew, and millions were lifted out of poverty, though inequality between rich and poor, and between coastal and inland regions became stark. The 2000s brought new milestones. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, WTO, cementing its integration into the global economy. Exports soared, foreign capital poured in, and China began climbing the value chain in manufacturing, producing not just cheap goods, but increasingly sophisticated products. Hosting the 2008 Beijing Olympics showcased the country's modernization to the world a spectacle of precision, pageantry, and national pride. Yet, the year also exposed vulnerabilities. The Sichuan earthquake tested disaster response, and the global financial crisis underscored China's interdependence with global markets. The 2010s marked a period of both ambition and assertiveness. Under Xi Jinping, who took leadership in 2012, the Chinese dream became a central narrative, promising national rejuvenation, economic prosperity, and global influence. Domestically, the Belt and Road Initiative launched massive infrastructure investments abroad, linking China to Asia, Africa, and Europe in a modern reimagining of the Silk Road. At home, technological innovation flourished. Bullet trains crisscrossed the country at 350 kilometers per hour. Mobile payment apps transformed daily commerce, and cities like Shenzhen became hubs for AI, biotech, and green energy. However, challenges deepened. Pollution and environmental degradation spurred a push toward renewable energy. Though coal remained significant, the urban housing market overheated, creating concerns about debt and affordability. Political life tightened under Xi's anti-corruption campaigns, which removed thousands of officials, but also consolidated power around the party. Leadership. In 2019, mass protests in Hong Kong tested Beijing's resolve, leading to the imposition of a sweeping national security law. The early 2020s were dominated by the COVID-19 pandemic. China's initial lockdowns in Wuhan and beyond were among the most stringent in the world, and its early containment was hailed as a success. But the prolonged zero-COVID policies strained the economy and public patience until restrictions were abruptly lifted in late 2022. The years that followed were a time of economic recalibration. Supply chains shifted, export growth slowed, and the government sought to boost domestic consumption while navigating geopolitical tensions with the United States and other nations. By 2025, China stood as the world's second-largest economy, a technological leader in sectors like 5G, solar power, and electric vehicles, and a central player in global politics. Its cities, Shanghai with its glass towers, Xi'an with its ancient walls, Chengdu with its tea houses, embodied a civilization both ancient and modern, navigating the balance between innovation and tradition, openness and control. From the terraces of Longsheng to the megacities on the coast, the pulse of China carried forward a steady rhythm shaped by millennia of resilience, adaptation, and quiet determination.